Good afternoon. This is the session where you get to work, and I mean, I'll do some setup, but for the most part, the idea is we're going to do some exercises, and so learn from each other. The title is kind of a play on words. I wanted to both focus on what is good design, or leadership in the market, and what does it take to lead the creation of good design or leadership in the organization. So this play on design excellence and leadership excellence didn't originate by any means with me. This is a classic, The Design of Design, something like 1969. But there, Gordon Clegg is looking at the design of the problem in order to look at the design of the designer, the person, what are the characteristics of the designer, and then looking at design of design. So to kind of let me calm down and you do some work, the first exercise is going to be just really quickly working in pairs. If your table didn't work out into an even number, then go for 3. But what characterizes bad design and what characterizes good design? So just a few minutes, just brainstorming. What comes to mind when you're thinking of, this design is really awkward to use, etc. So what were some of the things that came up under what characterizes bad design?
Bad, you said?
Yeah.
So that we had a couple difficult twos, but difficult to implement, difficult to use, difficult to maintain. There's no trade-offs in the design, so it tries to do too many things, like a Swiss Army knife, I guess, approach, which I guess works for a Swiss Army knife, though. The solution doesn't solve a problem, and it lacks observability or an ability to judge, monitor the system.
For another couple of groups, and then we'll move to good design.
Yeah, we come out several. So one is over design. So sometimes people make things too complicated, so it's not easy to use or not easy to understand. So I think that's not good. Also, yeah, we have 3 people we discussed. And another thing is sometimes we don't list all the options for user to choose or list the pros and cons of each option, so people do get full aware of the whole picture. And another thing we come out is not take account into all the quality attributes. For example, if you design for current need in future, you may have more users, so you need to consider scalability as well. If we don't consider that, it cannot survive for future need. Yeah.
Good. Sort of one of the things that I'm hearing is sort of the different design audiences, or different audiences for good design. There's the users, but there's also the developers and the operations team. So should we switch to good design? Great design. What are the characteristics of? Hear from another team on what characterizes good design.
So it needs to be flexible. What was this one? So it can trace back to functional requirements. We find it's very important if you end up designing something that doesn't actually serve a purpose, you're just wasting implementation effort. And takes timing issues into consideration, and user-friendly.
Good. When I think about what makes good design, I think at a high level of abstraction, the fit to context and fit to purpose come to mind. the quote about always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context comes from the 101 things I learned in building architecture school, but it has a lot of relevance to any kind of architecture, systems or software. So I'm going to step through some terms just as sort of a level setting and a motivating for the next exercise. Again, there's this play on words. System design matters. It matters, it's important, and the matters of design include systems, emergence, properties, decisions, constraints, trade-offs. So what is design? Herbert Simon's sort of common sense, pragmatic characterization, I like, we design to make things more the way they ought to be. Ought is a fraught, ethically fraught word, but we want to make them more the way we want them to be, or more stakeholders want them to be to attain goals. Highly recommend this TED Talk. In essence, Razekov is characterizing systems. The defining properties of any system are the properties of the whole that are not, you can't find them in any particular part. They emerge from the relationships in the whole. So for example, if you take a car, the example that he uses, the car can transport you. Take the car apart into all of its parts. None of the parts can transport you. The engine can't transport itself. So it's not just, an organization of parts. There's the coherence amongst the parts and cohere within a design with integrity. What system design? It isn't an architecture conference if we don't use Grady Butcher's definition of architecture. So here we go, at least one. Significant design decisions that shape the system. So core to our job is decisions. Requires our experience. It represents the solution approach that we're taking. Decisions constrain. And when we think about constraints, sort of the natural characterization is limiting, closing off alternatives. But as Alicia points out, if all you did was reduce the degrees of freedom, you would get organisms, organizations, systems, whatever we're looking at would be able to do less and less. So constraints don't just close off alternatives and options, but they enable alternatives options. And you can see that with sentence structure, for example. You look at a dictionary full of words, and the words have meaning, standalone meaning. But in order to make sense of what I'm saying, the rules of grammar tell us the ordering of the words such that we can understand, hopefully, and make sense of it. So there's this combination of constraint, but constraints enable. And so the value of decisions depends on the context. I like Diana's little illustration in the Lord of the Rings. Frodo's journey to destroy the ring is meaningful in that context. So we have this dual structure to decisions, not just the solution that we're going with, but understanding the forces and the desired outcomes, the context. Along the lines of a point that Sarah May makes about trade-offs, and that's the stuff of engineering, is to understand the pros and cons of the decisions. So we take microservices as an example, the gain and the pain or the price, gain scalability and fault tolerance at the price of additional complexity in operations. So this is breaking all the rules about slide design, more text. I'm going to let you, anybody want me to read it? Otherwise, just read it quietly. You'll read quicker than I can. So essentially, what jumps out at me when I see something like that is the inherent trade-off. In order to allow the teams to work independently and not have to coordinate at every decision point, they're allowing duplicate instances of libraries. Increases the size of the applet, but they're making the determination that the user doesn't notice, that it's insignificant compared to the size of the song. And so that's the trade-off. Properties dependent on the context. Ready? But the context, so if we think about microservices, we gain team independence at the cost of complexity for operations. If we think of that Spotify example, we're gaining, again, team independence and lower communication coordination overhead at the expense of the app size and cost of resources to the end user. And so our decisions don't neatly stay. They're technical decisions, technical choices we're making, but they don't neatly stay impacting just the developer or the technical community, right? So we have to understand the context, the use context, the value partners, the operations, the development context. Understand all of these different contexts, not just the outcomes or the goals in those contexts, but also what are the tensions or the forces that arise in those different contexts. And this is just making the point that in all of those different contexts, everyone has different mental models about how things work. So the problem is, or a good part of the problem is formulating the problem, understanding what those forces are. Donella Meadows, in Dancing with Systems, an essay that's also a chapter in her book, recommends, advises that in order to understand the problem, first observe the system. Get with the beat. Don't try to perturb the system, understand it. And then listen to the wisdom of the system and do as little as possible. Expose your mental models to the open air, draw things out, get them where we can see them. Stay humble, stay inquisitive and curious and willing to change. Expand time horizons, expand our thought horizons. So this gets us to setting up for an exercise. Rich Pictures comes out of the soft systems methodology of Checklin and Scholes. And it's just a free format picture of the world, or at least the world as relevant to the problem. And so there's no particular syntax and grammar, except for we're trying to capture who's involved in this interaction or this system, or this part of the world where a system may come to play. What are the interactions and flows of value and behaviors, and what are concerns or frustrations or goals? So here we have this mix of entities. We have the car rental company itself. We have different kinds of customers, corporate customers and individual customers, and their maintenance group and so on. So we have different players involved. We have the different concerns and interactions. So the concerns here are in the thought bubbles. So we're going to go back into our groups and work on a rich picture. The problem that I would love to have solved is one where following disasters, there's all this, we hear the stories, it's through Twitter, it's on the news, etc. And there's this willingness to help, there's this need for help, and there's no way to match willingness and help, need and willingness. So this is not the Red Cross doing massive immediate crisis intervention things. It's not the Coast Guard or whatever. It's as people rebuild their lives, and need help doing that, how do we match our willingness to help to the help that's needed? So people can, for example, tell their story being interviewed in public radio or in the news or whatever, but that's just one person. You know that person may be helped, but everybody else on their block is in the same situation as them, but they don't get to tell the story, so they don't get access to help. That makes sense? So the situation is people need help, people want to give help, provide help of different kinds, and we're going to do just a informal picture of the world of disaster, need, and help, and how do we connect those 2 points? There's no right answer. It's just working in the groups, identifying who's impacted, who could be involved, how could we provide some mechanism to connect need and willingness to help. That make sense? So it's sort of free form, no, speed is better than great because it's an exercise. There's just a sheet of paper that says, which picture. If your team works really quickly, you'll get to turn the page and work on forces. Pick some aspect of the problem. Volunteers to share what you learned. What did we learn about doing these system pictures?
This is a big problem. A very big problem. I was going to say it's a big problem. Big problem. Okay.
There's no clear problem boundary, so we have to define the problem, so to say. And another thing that I would say we discovered is that it's easy to directly jump on the technical solution of a small subset of the problem and feel well in there, and then you need to come back from time to time and see the big picture again.
Very good.
I think it's a good way to get a lot of ideas down on paper really fast.
Good. Yeah, sort of visual brainstorming, is that what you're saying? And so if we go back to Donella Meadows' advice, sort of starting out with just what does the world look like, sort of bounding the problem to the pieces of the world that are relevant, or almost, tantalizingly almost relevant, I think is a Buckminster Fuller term. But sort of how what is the shape of the world without our system, and then start to add our system into the world and see what we can do. Other observations?
Similar to what the one gentleman said, there wasn't any scope, but it's a good way to start quickly finding the questions of what things you need to start getting answered. So it's just a little bit more depth to what he said.
Yeah, and I relate that to this. What we need to do is load the context into our mental models and do that quickly and efficiently so that we can start to test our mental models, explore, elaborate, verify our mental models. We're making these decisions based on our understanding of rich, deep understanding of what are the different needs, the different priorities, how do they work in tension, what are we balancing, and so on. And so it's a way to early on get an understanding of the problem, and at any point, it's a way to quickly draw out, what's involved, how are the different pieces involved, what are the concerns. Other?
One thing we came across is that this problem is very common, and sort of to specialize on the specific disaster versus the generic needs. Like food and water have to go right immediately, even before you've set up something like a storage facility. So to think about where the problem has already been solved, and then to build on that.
Very good, yeah. Other? Did anybody get to doing the force field? The pros and cons, forces for and against. What did you learn doing that?
Is it, makes you really have to think about what kind of problems you have to solve before you can even start fixing the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So there's problems before. It's not like you're just solving one main problem. You have things that you can't control, like weather and lack of resources. And it could be like a current situation where you're still flooded, so you can't even start building. But then there's the things like being able to get help from like FEMA and volunteers and donors. But just getting all that settled out, you have to figure that out before you can start solving the problem.
Good. So basically, this exercise is a sales pitch for Michael's tutorial tomorrow on visual thinking. Any other observations before we move on? I introduced these two particular tools, the rich picture or the system visualization and the force field analysis, or the identifying what are the different forces that are in tension, because it's so core to what we do at different levels of scope. There's what is this problem and what are the boundaries of this problem, but as we move into the problem, there's the next level of what we have to discover and uncover and elaborate, and so this identifying the forces and the tensions is something we do over and over and over again. What are the pieces and the relationships, the interactions, how do they build to a capability, what are the properties? We do that over and over. We may get to a more expressed language, just so we have a common technical language for our models and views as we get more into the system. But it's the same pattern of thinking, what's the context, what's relevant in the context, interactions, qualities, etc. Other thoughts or reflections, observations? So in addition to systems and what makes a system, and uncovering the desired outcomes and the forces, and another part of our job in working towards good or great design is matters of integrity, structural integrity. The thing doesn't fail or doesn't fail in ways we can't recover from, doesn't fail in ways that are unsafe for people, bleed private information or whatever. Design integrity, things like conceptual integrity and so on. Sustainability. We're going to step into structural integrity for a moment. So this goes all the way back to the time of Julius Caesar and Vitruvius writing on building architecture. But the fundamental principles of architecture are very relatable to modern software systems. The durability, utility, and beauty. So durability, doesn't fail and it lasts. It doesn't, when it translates from Keynote to PowerPoint, it doesn't alter the spacing. This is a classic in the complex systems, safety space, How Complex Systems Fail by Richard Cook. And noting, highlighting that complex systems are intrinsically hazardous. And yet, they don't fail all that often. And the reason they don't fail all that often is because of the work we do to put in sort of layers of safety. So complex systems heavily defended against failure. That's work that we do. When they fail, there's learning from failure. So this is an engineering book, but again, relevant. The key point being, things fail, learn from failure. Back to Richard Cook, safety is one of those emergent properties, not just of the technical system, but of the socio-technical system. And so when things fail, it's up to the humans in the loop to recover gracefully. And then there's feeding what we learn. The transparency, the openness, the willingness to learn from failure, feeding that back into the design. So that's balancing the strive to create systems that don't fail, that do fail gracefully, easy to recover from, that provide observability and monitoring so that the humans in the socio-technical system can help us to recover from failure, etc. So sort of thinking about systems in that way. Looking to prevent failure, but also looking to fail safely. So we have design excellence as this property of the system produced by its designers. And now we're going to sort of switch into looking at the characteristics of architects as designers that create great designs. Not individually, and that's, if it was just up to us, it would be a sort of personal and technical matter. But because we create complex systems with other designers, there's the whole organizational and strategic dimension. So, somewhat different situation from Glegg's inventive, artistic, and rational. We have to add in the make others successful. Not just make the system successful, but make others successful dimension to it. I pulled this from Jessica, or Jessie Tron, as she's known on Twitter. Great teams make great people, not the other way around. And so there's this thinking about effectiveness in the organizational sense. So we're going to set up now to do the next exercise. It's 4 parts. So the one piece of the exercise is sort of the know-do-be way of characterizing architects' expertise, knowledge, and activities. So there's what are the responsibilities? What do architects do? What are the activities of architects? There's qualities like comfortable with ambiguity that just came up, good listener, etc. And then there's resources, which is what books and so forth that we recommend to each other. And then we've got a sheet per area. So I'm going to step through the different wings of the butterfly, the architect becoming a butterfly. So personal, areas of personal effectiveness, self-awareness, empathy, so empathy for the users, empathy for the developers, empathy for oneself, sort of understanding ourselves and having empathy. There's knowledge like how do we, this human mechanism, how does it work? How are we effective? So things in the embodied cognition space, they've done studies that showed, for example, that taking notes by hand increases retention, memory over typing. And so there's, understanding how our own mechanisms work and human mechanisms work, and so that we can work on that and be more effective. Technical effective, I just threw up a whole bunch of things because that's kind of a joke. It's like everything that we're in this conference for, it's everything that we've been paying attention to. I mean, when I say joke, I mean I'm just being playful because you can't possibly read that list. But it's what we're accustomed to thinking of when we think of the architect as a experienced technical expert. Right? In another book called Design of the Designer, Fred Brooks said his key takeaways are, as guidance to people who want to be better designers. Study other designs, look at how other people solve problems, draw what you see as you're studying other designs, draw your own ideas, write down your assumptions, and do it. Design. Another way to convey information is heuristics. Eberhard Rechten, when he wrote this book in like 91, recognized that because system architecting isn't a science, the way we communicate knowledge is through the way we understand our own knowledge and apply our own knowledge and communicate knowledge is through heuristics. And so that book is heuristics based. And he defines heuristics as statements of common or contextual sense that make sense in a context. And they aid in different aspects of the work that we do. So developing concepts, problem solving, decision making, and so on. Rebecca's characterization of heuristics, reminder to us, is that they plausible, in context valuable, plausible approaches to solving problems, not infallible ones. So here's some examples in the defining the boundary of the system, the boundary of components, and interfaces space. Heuristics like don't partition by slicing through regions where there's, don't have chatty interfaces if there's a distribution boundary. Make performance as insensitive to unknown external factors as possible. So hexagonal pattern would come into play, etc. Strategic, why is this important? Setting direction, informing and influencing business direction, and setting technical direction. Heuristics, things like Steve Jobs, everybody thinks that focus is what you say yes to, but actually focusing is saying no. Jeff Bezos making the point that some of the decisions that we make are high consequence and irreversible. Once you've made them, you can't backtrack, you can't reverse them, and those decisions you need to pay careful attention to. Organizational effectiveness, a leadership area, building relationships, building teams, persuasion and influence. Jerry Weinberg said that when you encounter a problem, no matter what it first looks like, there's a people problem. Other heuristics, don't ever stop talking about the system. I really like Nivea's point there because it gave me me permission to repeat myself. Saying the longer I'm the leader, the more I realize that just saying it once is as good as not having said it at all. That we need to say things, express things, communicate things over and over. And that was a big learning point for me, because I kind of feel like I'm overstating if I repeat. In the exercise, as I said, there's two parts to it. The do, what are the activities, listening, communicating, building relationships. The be, empathetic, comfortable with ambiguity. The know, what are some books or other resources that we recommend to peers in the team. So Agiris is a key. Introduce concepts like the ladder of inference, the elephant in the room, organizational defense mechanisms or routines, and how to overcome them. Shines, humble inquiry, addressing humility and questions in style. So it's a very practical, little, quick, easy to read, but influential. And Gary Klein, sources of power. So a lot of decision-making material now sort of focuses on cognitive biases and so on, how we predictably irrational style, sort of how our decision mechanisms fail, and the sources of power is focused on the other side of that, sort of how we make decisions effectively, what we draw on to make effective decisions. So that's just a small collection of me doing, the organizational know, do, be, just to illustrate. So it's breaking back up into our groups, and you can either all work on one and move through them, or split into twos and pick an area to work on. But essentially, there's the know, do, be framework that characterizes activities and what our personal characteristics are and what we need to know to be effective. And there's on the other side, there's context and heuristic. So that we have them in the center. Either work is 4 or 2 and just work through both sides of at least one effectiveness area. Okay, let's draw back together and hear from y'all, hear what we learned. So as people report back and share what they wrote down, feel free to add to. So who's going to share what they learned?
Pick on my own table if nobody goes. We should share. We're going to share. We were looking at organizational responsibility, and what are some of the do responsibilities, or was there something interesting that you noticed? I'm putting you guys on the spot.
We learned that we took the wrong approach, and we're looking at it from an organizational standpoint instead of leadership.
Okay.
To be an effective organizational leader. So we kind of took the wrong approach and got down the wrong path.
Yeah.
So some of the things that, we first were just, saying, what's the reporting structure? They need to provide budget, all these type of things, and it's like, okay. And then from a leadership perspective is how to be effective in getting some of these done, from, getting the correct infrastructure, like your office space, to getting the right, computers, et cetera, to and also working out what type of orgs structure there is, and working with all those pieces. So it was hard to determine what the right leader is for that, but it also is, when you know there is an effective leader in an organization, you see it.
Yeah. So did you have no Conway's Law in your...
I don't know what that means.
Conway's Law? Basically, the communication structure in the organization is going to be mirrored in the communication structure of the system. And so the way I paraphrase it is, if the architecture of the system and the architecture of the organization differ or at odds, the architecture of the organization wins. It will drive the architecture of the system. And so when you're saying you sort of know the pieces and so forth, there's also know how that influences the technical piece. Anybody else work on organizational effectiveness? What did you learn about what the architect does, and as a result, some characteristics of an effective architect?
Yeah, I mean, so for responsibilities, we had communicative, inclusive of others and the stakeholders, relationship builder, leading by example. I guess we didn't really tie them into leadership as this sort of thing. But, for the qualities, we just said results-oriented, humility, repetitive communication, adaptability, willingness to get stuff done from an organizational perspective. Yeah.
Other? Anybody else tackle organizational effectiveness or the leadership, the working with others, making others successful piece? One of the reasons that I use that model is just to drive our attention into these different spaces. Otherwise, we just stay in the technical bubble. And we really have to be effective working with teams, working with senior management, things I think it sort of came up in that group and in this group. So another volunteer to share what you learned in a different area then? Good. Yeah. The reward for good work is to get more work to be done.
The personal effectiveness, and actually some of these are similar to what we said for organizational effectiveness, but for responsibility in all the categories, we had effective communication as a responsibility for all of these things. But then when it came to personal effectiveness, the consideration of others, respect for others, and I think really we had more qualities, but empathy, creativity, patience, humility, self-awareness, and adaptability in the personal space. And for resources, I think the title is Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman. I can't remember the exact title of the book, but it talks about how people think and how they react to things. So yeah, for personal effectiveness. We didn't really have any heuristics with it.
Good.
Be kind, I guess.
Very good. Yeah, I'm kind of thinking, willing to take risks, like launch, speak up in a large group. Are there others willing to share what they learned?
So we did technical effectiveness, and rather than going through everything that we had on here, I just wanted to point out that as we were doing like a lot of the qualities, and then I started looking over personal effectiveness, I realized there's a lot of overlapping things. Like your personal effectiveness is required for you to be good at technical effectiveness. I think that was my big takeaway from that.
Good.
Yeah, for personal effectiveness, you don't have to be a technical expert. You can be also, yeah, but you have to be good at least at a couple of these. You, like a good manager might be personally effective by being very strategic and organizational, but an architect can also be, they may not be the best technical person, but if they can work out the strategy and the organizational pieces of it, they can actually be very personally effective.
Good. Any other observations like that? Any heuristics?
It's hard to do that part, to really think about the right contexts and how to establish that.
Yeah.
So we had a heuristic at our table. I could share that real quick. The heuristics are hard, and I was lucky enough to chat with Rebecca Worsbrock for a little while, and she taught me a technique, which was basically storytelling. So I started just asking questions and saying, hey, well, tell me about something that happened at work recently. Listen, jotted some notes, and oh, well, how, what happened? What did you do, in response to that context? And then we came up with the yes, sir heuristic, which is basically there was major organizational change, new management coming in, and one of the responses to that was, yes, right away, we'll do what you need. And then as a consequence of that particular, heuristic being applied, they were able to get some things done without friction. So.
Good. Storytelling is a great way to set context. So some of the different ways I think about context is just, where in the process are we? What activities are we doing? So if I locate to some specific thing that I'm trying to do right now, identify components or define boundaries. So storytelling, painting a picture, or some piece of the process, and then it's the mapping of the rule of thumb or heuristic, situating it within the context. So that's great. I really like that storytelling. Other observations? So, architecture is inescapably connected to everything. It's sort of one of the ways I think about it's not that we need to know everything now. We're on a journey. This is a path that we're taking, and so it's becoming more aware of what are the different dimensions of effectiveness, so that we can sort of iterate on ourselves as one of the things we're designing, growing our effectiveness. Sort of the do the design, the study designs, move into the areas of interpersonal team building, etc. So it's one kind of map of the space is that sort of personal, technical, organizational, strategic. If you want to leave your work and share it, I'll take pictures of them and put them up. I can tweet them under SATURN Design Leadership hashtag, just some of the pictures of the ones that are maybe more filled out, or even if it's only one point on it, but it's a really useful point, share it on that hashtag, but then also just put it on my website or the SATURN website. I'm not sure what the preference would be there, but so we could share the work done. So, wrap-up comment? Any observations? Good, thank you for pitching in and getting the work done, because really relied on you doing it.